We are a little less than 15 minutes away from the Senate Judiciary Committee's hearing on police brutality in America. Here are some live pictures from Capitol Hill. This hearing, when it begins, will be the first hearing led by the Republican-led committee since George Floyd died while in police custody more than 3 weeks ago. The hearing is set to touch on police use of force and community relations. Nearly a dozen witnesses, from civil rights leaders to law enforcement officials, are expected to testify. Earlier today, President Trump signed an executive order on police reform at the White House. The order is meant to incentivize police departments into adopting new standards in the use of force. Here is some of what the president had to say before he made the order official.
Americans believe we must support the brave men and women in blue who police our streets and keep us safe. Americans also believe we must improve accountability, increase transparency, and invest more resources in police training, recruiting, and community engagement. Reducing crime and raising standards are not opposite goals. They are not mutually exclusive. They work together. They all work together.
Other major cities across the country are also making changes to their police forces. In New York, the NYPD has ended its undercover anti-crime unit. Chicago has implemented a review board to assess policing policies. And Seattle has completely banned all police chokeholds. For more on all of this, let's bring in Louis L. Reed. He is a national organizer for Cut 50. That is a bipartisan group looking to cut crime and incarceration rates nationwide. Hi, Louis. Thanks so much for being with us. We really appreciate it. What will you be looking for most out of this hearing? Is there something specific you want to see accomplished here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first and foremost, I'm ecstatic that the hearing is happening, considering that the recent incidents that has essentially swelled our nation, particularly dealing with the George Floyd's brutal killing in front of the world. What I'm looking for to emerge out of today's hearing is one of two things. Number one, Congress, the world, needs to look into the eyes, hear the voices of those families who have lost their loved ones to a police system that has been sworn to protect and serve our community. The second thing that we're looking out of this committee is action, right? This is more than a moment. We need a movement. And this is not a time for political posturing. This is not a time for people to pontificate. This is a time to actually get things done. And I think that the voices of those individuals who are going to be there speaking with Congress, talking about their experiences within their respective communities, I think that is something that is far too long overdue.
Now, you have an intimate relationship with policing in this country, and you know all too well the power incarceration can have on families across the country. You yourself served 14 years in prison. Can you tell us a little bit about what that experience taught you and what you're trying to do with Cut 50?
Sure. Quite frankly, that experience taught me this: those closest to the problem are also closest to the solution, but often furthest from resources and power. And so what we're trying to do at Cut 50 is we're trying to legislate through humanization. So our theory of change is legislation through humanization, taking those individuals who have been impacted by the system, people such as myself, people such as my family who supported me while I was incarcerated, people who are survivors of harm, people who are in substance abuse recovery, all who comprise what we call our empathy network. And essentially, we want to make sure that legislation is going to be smart, is going to be effective, and is going to have the input of those voices who can really help our lawmakers develop a viable solution.
And then how do you believe fundamental police reform can affect the incarceration rates?
Well, we have to consider this. Our police officers are the sentries that stand in the doorway of our mass incarceration issue that we have here in the United States of America. Think about this. There are more than 2.2 million people incarcerated in the United States of America. There are more than 70 million people who have criminal histories in our country, in our communities. That is entirely too much. We are approximately 5% of the world's population, but we incarcerate more than 25% of the world's incarceration. Think about this. We incarcerate more people in the United States of America, the land of the free, the land of opportunity, the land of second chances, more than China. And our police have a direct connection. They are literally the key that unlocks the door to our criminal justice system.
And why is that? What are the forces behind this mass incarceration? What is leading so many Americans to become incarcerated?
I think that is systemic institutionalized racism. You know, I would love to be able to give you a $5 word that can give you an academic understanding of about, you know, how we got into this issue. But the fact of the matter is that it's just a systemic institutionalized racism. You have people who are in Black, brown, and poor white communities who are economically disenfranchised. We have been set back for far too long. And what has happened is that our society has used mass incarceration as a panacea of the sort to essentially lock us up and throw away the key. But there's a change that is happening in this country. I was just thinking about Bruce Lee. And this is going to sound like an odd connection, but I watched the Bruce Lee story the other night, and he talked about being water. And there's a tidal wave. There's a tidal wave of change. There's a tidal wave of hope. There's a tidal wave of new opportunity that is literally cleansing this country. It's cleansing this country from mass incarceration. It's cleansing this country from racism. It's cleansing this country from our schools and our communities being underfunded and over-policed. It is cleansing this country in a way that we haven't seen probably in this generation. So if you would have asked me how I felt the week before last about what's happening, I would have said I was infuriated. If you would have asked me last week, I would have said I was depressed. But this week, I'm hopeful.
Well, that is great news. And isn't it true, I mean, just to get back to your earlier point, that, you know, Blacks are incarcerated for drug offenses and for mental illness at far greater rates than whites?
Absolutely. African Americans are incarcerated at a rate that is 5 times more than our white counterparts. And, you know, as we say where I come from, the fix is in. When you think about how people who are Black, brown, and poor white in this country, and it's not just African Americans, you have people who are poor white, but specifically speaking about African Americans, when you think about the rate of incarceration in this country, look, our tax dollars can be going towards education. Our tax dollars can be going towards mental health reform. Our tax dollars could and should be going towards reentry solutions rather than locking people up. If people commit crimes in this country, even if they are incarcerated, we should be creating an opportunity for education. We should be creating an opportunity for rehabilitation. We should not be creating an opportunity where we are setting people up to failure. And what has happened in the United States of America is that we have created this trapdoor to failure rather than a springboard to success.
And when you talk about, you know, rehabilitation and alternatives to incarceration, are you talking about certain types of crimes, or do you believe that should be the case across the board?
I think that should be the case across the board. Look, I did almost 14 years in federal prison. I was in with people who were very precocious in their thinking, very artistic in their creative expression. You have some of the best and brightest in our criminal justice system, in our nation's jails and prisons. And if given the opportunity, if set up for success, we would be able to see our next generation, dare I say our current generations, mechanical engineers, physicians, healthcare providers, thought leaders, et cetera. And so when I'm talking about creating opportunity for people who are incarcerated, it shouldn't matter what kind of crime you committed. If you are incarcerated in our jails and prison in the United States of America, you should have the opportunity to come out better and not necessarily bitter.
All right, let's talk a little bit about some of the police reforms that are on the table right now. We know that the NYPD is eliminating its anti-crime unit, which is a group of plainclothes officers who blend in to fight crime, but have caused tension in their relationships with the communities they police. So here's what NYPD Commissioner Dermot Shea had to say about the move. Let's listen.
Effective immediately, we will be transitioning those units, roughly 600 people citywide, into a variety of assignments, including Detective Bureau, neighborhood policing, and other assignments.
So, Louis, what type of message is being sent here, and how might it help the situation going forward?
Look, law enforcement officers provide the essential protection that all Americans require to raise their families and lead productive lives. The relationship between our fellow citizens and law enforcement officers is an important element in their ability to be able to provide that protection. By working directly with the community, law enforcement officers can help foster a safe environment where we can all prosper. And unfortunately, there have been instances where some officers have misused that authority, challenging the trust of the American people, hence the reason why we are having this conversation, and hence the reason why we're having a Senate Judiciary hearing around this. There are tragic consequences for individuals, victims, and we have to make sure that we are lock in step with our brave men and women who are in uniform. They need to be working with the community. We need to be working together. We are a family in this fight. We are family in this fight for equality. We are family in this fight for justice. And we are also a family in this fight to make sure that in the words and in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are not just included equal, but all of us should be in the pursuit of health, happiness, and liberty. And that's not liberty for the exclusive. That's liberty for the inclusive. Democrats at their best believe in justice. I'm sorry. Democrats at their best believe in justice. Republicans at their best believe in liberty. And all of us at our best, as Americans, we should be believing in liberty and justice for all.
All right. So, as you know, a Republican, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, is drawing up legislation for the Senate on police reform. You know, unlike the House Democrats' proposal, he says his legislation will include more training for police officers instead of an outright ban on no-knock warrants and chokeholds. What do you think of Senator Scott's position on this?
Look, this is a step in the absolute right direction. I can't sit here and say that I have all the answers. I think that just how it took all of us to contribute to the mass incarceration issue that we have in our country, to the failed mental health system that we have in our country, it's going to take all hands on deck and even more to make sure that we get out of it. And I am glad that Senator Tim Scott is actually leading the charge in this conversation and also bringing those individuals who have been impacted by the issue to the table. Again, those closest to the problem are also closest to the solution, but furthest from resources and power. And Tim Scott, Senator Tim Scott, I should say, is actually bridging that chasm between the two.
And I'm curious what you think of President Trump's record on, criminal justice reform. As you know, you're a big supporter of the First Step Act, which was a bipartisan criminal justice bill signed by President Trump in 2018, I believe. So what do you think of his record on this topic?
Well, this is what I think. I think that it's hard for people who have a heart, who are a human being, to look in the faces of families who have lost their loved ones to police violence and not be moved to a sense of empathy, not be moved to a sense of compassion. It's been reported that the families of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and other people who have lost their loved ones to police encounters, that they met with the president just this afternoon. And I personally think that it is impossible for you to look at the grief-stricken eyes of a mother who lost her son to someone that was supposed to protect and serve her community and not be moved. not see a reflection of humanity in those tears. And so I think that this administration, while some may say that it's a day late and a dollar too short, so long as we are moving in the direction of having comprehensive reform, just like how we had in the First Step Act, I think that this is a second step in the right direction, particularly with our eyes focused on police reform in our country.
So let me ask you about the president's executive order that he signed earlier this afternoon. In it, he specifically says chokeholds will be banned unless the officer feels threatened. Now, we know that feeling threatened can be somewhat subjective, right? You know, and that's a little bit of kind of what got us here in the first place, the idea of who and what constitutes a threat. Should we have more specific language around this?
Without question. That is without question and without compunction. We should have more specific language around this. And I think that we should also be looking at several other areas of foci as well. Number one, we should ban strangleholds and also chokeholds from all law enforcement practices. All of our law enforcement officers should be required to take de-escalation training. As a social worker, I can tell you that when I was working in that particular field, that was a mandatory requirement when you were dealing with people who had what we consider co-occurring disorders. Also, we need to require warnings before officers discharge their weapon. In addition, we need to require exhaustive all alternatives before shooting. And I think that this is imperative as well. We need to have a duty to intervene. What we saw in George Floyd's situation was an aberration of humanity. Those officers who sat by idly with their hands in their pocket, cavalierly watching the crowd, they should have intervened in that situation, and we should definitely make sure that that should be a requirement as we are talking about police reform. And last but not least, there should be a required use of force continuum. And I think that this language is a step in the right direction, but there is definitely more to be fleshed out in this skeletal proposal.
And I also have a question for you about the issue of mental health, because we know that in many communities that don't have the resources of some wealthier communities, there's a certain percentage that may be suffering from mental health issues. And police aren't always trained in how to deal with people who have these mental health issues. And when it comes to policing a community that may have a greater percentage of people with these challenges simply because the resources are not there, is that something that this legislation should be addressing as well? Because it seems to me many of these situations that lead to escalated violence between a police officer and an individual, there's sometimes an element of mental health involved.
Look, I think that we ask and want and expect too much from our law enforcement officers. We expect them to protect and serve, in addition to being the marriage counselor, in addition to being an LCSW, in addition to being the preacher, in addition to being the Department of Social Services worker. We require too much from them. And so what we need to make sure is that when we are thinking about and introducing legislation, that legislation is going to make sure that not only are officers focused on the task at hand, but they have the ancillary supports from the community that can accommodate them to a call that very well could be de-escalated just as a result of having an individual who is not necessarily in a uniform. And so we have this moment in time right now where we can convert this situation that is happening in our country into a movement. And I think that this is a step in the right direction.